So I just wanted to review a little bit this process. You know, sometimes I work small and get an idea, and then I go ahead and make it bigger. In this case, I worked big, and I wanted to go back and work small just so that I could explain it. This is one of the great things about teaching because it makes me rock back and forth between scale and method, and I learn. So anyway, this is basically where I began, although the fabrics are a little different. There was a green cross, and I did add these after I basted this down, but just for, an example, I stitched invisibly in the middle of the pieces, leaving the edges open so that I might come back in and perhaps add another piece, and I'd be able to do that because it's not stitched down. In the case of coming into a corner, though, this is loose. You could stitch this down, but when you go to do this side, it's best probably to take this baste out and have this one really free so it's easy to manipulate. And you basically can see the basting on the other side. One thing, this glue stitch basting, invisible baste, can be done two ways. It can be done where you take a tiny running stitch and a long float on the back, or you can take a tiny back stitch, which is actually easier to make invisible because you can really adjust the size of the stitch when you go back. But I just wanted to mention that if you do use the backstitch style, it's harder to pull out. So in this case, I use the running stitch style because I might want to pull some of these out if I want to continue to work around the edges. So the next step was to applique this to the base cloth just by going around the edge. Now I tend to use any color thread that I have around. Of course, you can match it exactly if you don't want it to show, but I really don't mind the stitches showing. And when I do patchwork as applique like this, I very often want to choose a thread that's going to contrast a little bit with the background so that after I'm finished, I'm going to end up with an outline that goes all the way around. And the reason I want to see that is because I very often use it for reference. And I can talk about a couple of reasons for that as well. So I'm just going to stitch this down to the background because that was basically one of the layers that I was using in this current project, and I'm just creating it smaller because I've also created one for the other side so I can show you how I connected it. Okay, so I did that. I sewed all around the edge, and as you can see, I've got a little outline on the back. And just let me mention, a lot of times this process to manage the layers, this is a very thin cloth this time. Actually, I reconsidered since I was thinking of creating that shadow effect with the patchwork behind. I actually chose for this trial just what-ifing using a really thin cloth. And in this case, it probably wouldn't be necessary, but in some cases, I just take the basting out, right? And then I cut away the fabric behind the applique. So in this way, if the fabric hadn't been that thin, I would be cutting away extra cloth, right? These scissors are bird-like and they also chirp. So in this way, it becomes again like patchwork, just like I had kind of pieced it, you know. I'm kind of doing kind of a ragamuffin approach here, but you get the idea. Oops, I'm sorry, I keep going off the screen. I'm getting very impatient with video, to tell you the truth. I'm starting to not enjoy it too much at all. It's kind of cutting into my sewing time, and I'm reconsidering that a lot. I've said all these things so many times before, and I'm just even too lazy to go back and find the videos where I said that. Maybe a sign of old age. Anyway, you get the idea. To manage the layers, you can always do that. But I didn't really need to do it here. And then I made this one, and in lieu of the patchwork that I did in the ground so that it would show through this cloth, I just put a piece of black and white check here just to shorten the process. And the idea here was that, you know, I had this one, and I was just going to use one base cloth and basically create a whole back and just match it up. And I used to do this, make 2 patchwork quilts and sew them back to back. And what I used to do is just use a either a pin or a thread and needle and start to match them up. When you start, it's a little tricky. Start to match them up corner to corner. And actually, you know, the old style of quilts where they were tied? Doing that. Actually creating a tie. And then just tying them to the corners. Now that was sometimes a permanent solution in old-time quilting. You do one corner, one corner, one corner. You can always take these out, but it's initially a way to match up front to back. But you know, as I did this, you know, which is the same as reconsidering anything, you know, I just said no. I said, I don't think so. In this case, I'm not going to do this at all. I'm going to take this off. Undo the basting here, and I thought, okay, since I want that shadow effect, why couldn't I just take a piece of fabric that has some kind of pattern on it, right, and use it as batting, and not batting or backing, either one. Maybe no batting. I could get the shadow effect, depending on what I use here. I could get more than one layer. You know, the thing you have to consider, if you've got a two layers of patchwork back to back, 2 quilts maybe, I think it kind of would limit me in terms of what I would do as embellishment, because one side would be going to the other side. And a lot of times when I work on a single layer, and I do a lot of my embroidery and stitching and everything, or even on a double layer, but in the end I might put something else on the other side, and then I would continue to do stitching. But in this case, I'm just not in the mood for the 2 sides. So I'm going to take the 2 cloths apart, actually. And I may approach this green cloth, cross cloth in this manner with the shadow effect. But I'm not going to have the cross on the back. It just doesn't work for me right now.